The Great Victorian Stink of 1858. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine London, the summer of 1858. No electric lights, no cars, no air conditioning. The streets are cobbled, the houses are dark, and the city smells. Well, smells is too polite a word. The city reeks. Now, London in the mid-19th century was already known for having a certain aroma. People lived in close quarters, personal hygiene was negotiable, and the River Thames ran right through the heart of the city. It should have been a scenic, glistening waterway. Instead, it had become the ultimate dumping ground for anything and everything people wanted to get rid of. Animal waste, industrial runoff, dead dogs, spoiled food, and yes, all of the contents of the city's chamber pots. For years, Londoners had tolerated the smell. They weren't exactly used to it, but they'd learned to live with it, the way you might learn to ignore the sound of a noisy clock. But then came the summer of 1858, the hottest summer in living memory. Day after day, the sun beat down on the brown, sluggish waters of the Thames, and all those things that had been quietly rotting away in the river, they began to blossom. Newspapers called it the Great Stink. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was reality. Imagine walking along the embankment and seeing the river not a pleasant blue or green, but a thick, glutinous brown. Bubbles rising slowly to the surface, popping with a sound you could hear and a smell you could taste. The stink was so bad that people gagged just walking across the bridges. Some fainted. The Thames flowed past the Houses of Parliament and the odor did not discriminate. Inside the grand Gothic building, lawmakers sat in the stifling summer air, their faces pale and sweaty, papers pressed over their noses. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to neutralize the smell, but it was like spraying perfume on a bonfire, utterly useless. Members of Parliament joked that the river was trying to join in the debate. But there was nothing funny about the consequences. The Thames wasn't just a river, it was London's main source of drinking water, which means that all those delightful substances floating in it were being poured, quite literally, into people's cups. Cholera outbreaks had already claimed thousands of lives in the preceding decades, and though scientists like John Snow had begun to suspect that contaminated water was the cause, many still believed in the miasma theory, the idea that bad smells themselves cause disease. The Great Stink of 1858 didn't just make people uncomfortable, it became a political crisis. The newspapers covered it with a mix of horror and grim humor. One reporter noted that gentlemen walking along the Strand were seen holding scented handkerchiefs to their faces, but with expressions that suggested they might as well have been holding rotting fish. Finally, Parliament acted, not because of cholera, not because of public health campaigns, but because they themselves couldn't stand the smell any longer. The result was one of the greatest feats of Victorian engineering, the construction of London's modern sewer system, masterminded by a man named Joseph Bazalgette. His design used miles of underground brick tunnels to carry waste far downstream, away from the city's water supply. It took years to complete, but when it was finished, the difference was astonishing. The Thames slowly recovered, the smell diminished, and outbreaks of waterborne diseases began to decline. Bazalgette became a quiet hero of public health, though most Londoners never thought about him while enjoying their cleaner, fresher city. The Great Stink remains one of those odd moments in history when a city's fate turned not on politics, not on war, but on the simple, undeniable fact that sometimes the smell is just too bad to ignore. And perhaps, lying in bed tonight, you can be grateful that no matter how stuffy your summer evening feels, you are not drifting to sleep with the perfume of the Thames in 1858 wafting through your window. Picture this. It's a chilly winter morning in Victorian London. You wake up, open your tiny window, and instantly regret it. Not because of the cold, but because you can't actually see anything. What greets you isn't fresh air, but a thick yellowish-brown fog that smells faintly like someone burned a million pieces of old furniture at once. This is not the romantic mist of storybooks. This is the London pea souper, a fog so dense and so dirty that it's practically a stew for your lungs. The origins of the fog. The fog wasn't entirely new. London had always been a bit misty, thanks to the River Thames and Britain's naturally damp climate. But in the 19th century, things took a very coal-flavored turn. Coal was the heartbeat of Victorian industry. It powered factories, heated homes, and even ran the steam engines that made London a global powerhouse. Unfortunately, every ton of coal burned released enormous amounts of soot, smoke, and sulfur into the air. In winter, when thousands of households lit their fireplaces at once, the city's air became an enormous chimney. The natural fog mixed with coal smoke, creating a thick yellow smog that clung to every surface and every lung. What it looked like. People often describe the fog as being so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Street lamps glowed dimly like candles under a dirty glass jar. Horse-drawn carriages moved at a snail's pace because drivers couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. In some cases, people had to walk with one hand on the wall just to navigate the streets. And even then, they'd often bump into strangers. For thieves, this was a golden age. You could snatch a pocket watch and disappear into the yellow haze before your victim could even shout. If you lived in Victorian London during a pea super, your nose would be in for an unforgettable experience, and not in a good way. The smog smelled like burnt tar, rotten eggs, and wet ash all mixed together. That sulfur smell. It came from sulfur dioxide, a byproduct of coal combustion. It wasn't just unpleasant, it could actually choke you. People sometimes wore scarves or handkerchiefs over their mouths, but these were more about warmth than health. When they removed them, the cloth was often blackened with soot. Health hazards breathing in the London fog was like inhaling a fireplace. Cases of bronchitis, pneumonia, and asthma skyrocketed during winter. The fog could irritate your eyes, make you cough for weeks, and, in the worst cases, be deadly. It didn't help that sanitation in London was already questionable. The air was dirty, the water was dirty, and now the fog was sealing it all in like the lid on a slow cooker. Foggy anecdotes. One famous story tells of a man who set out to walk across the street during a particularly dense fog and ended up lost for hours, eventually finding himself miles away from home. Another tale, probably exaggerated but still widely told, claims that a driver once mistook the shadowy figure in the fog for a pedestrian and slowed his carriage, only to discover it was actually a lamppost. Fog as a cultural symbol. Interestingly, while Londoners hated the fog in real life, writers and artists adored it. Charles Dickens used fog as a metaphor for confusion and moral murkiness in novels like Bleak House. Painters like Claude Monet even came to London specifically to paint the city in its foggy glory, though they probably went home with a nasty cough. The slow decline. It wasn't until the 20th century that people began to fully understand the health dangers of the smog. By then, London's air pollution had become infamous worldwide. In 1952, decades after the Victorian era, a particularly severe Great Smog killed thousands, finally forcing stricter environmental laws. But in Victorian times, it was just life. You bundled up, lit your fireplace, and hoped the fog would lift before you lost your way to the bakery. Why this made you smell terrible. And yes, the fog made you smell awful too. The soot clung to your hair, your clothes, even your skin. Imagine going to a dinner party and everyone smells faintly like a burnt kettle. Perfume couldn't hide it, soap could barely touch it. In other words, if you were a Londoner back then, you weren't just breathing the fog, you were the fog. Imagine walking down a medieval street and the stench is overwhelming. The air carries the smell of rotting food, human waste, and unwashed bodies. Forget hand sanitizer. People barely even understood the concept of germs. The result? An environment where disease spread faster than gossip in a royal court. The lack of bathing culture. In the Middle Ages, regular bathing wasn't just rare, it was sometimes considered dangerous. Many believed that hot water opened the pores, letting in bad air, that could make you sick. So people stuck to dry washing, wiping their faces with cloths or rubbing themselves with scented oils and powders. This didn't kill bacteria, it just covered the smell. Water was dangerous. Drinking water straight from rivers or wells often made people sick. It was full of waste from humans and animals, so most avoided it. Instead, they drank beer or ale, even kids, because brewing killed some of the harmful bacteria. But this didn't help with cleanliness. Imagine never rinsing your mouth except with alcohol. Toilets? Not exactly. The concept of proper sewage systems barely existed. In towns, people dumped chamber pots out of their windows, sometimes with a shout of "Gardyloo" to warn pedestrians. Streets became open sewers. The dirt mixed with horse manure, rotting food scraps, and dead rats. Clothing wasn't washed. Often laundry was a huge task without modern machines. Most people wore the same clothes for weeks or months. Wool and linen absorbed sweat and body oils, creating the perfect breeding ground for lice, fleas, and other parasites. These tiny creatures were more than just annoying. They spread deadly diseases like the plague. The plague. Other killers. The infamous Black Death in the 14th century wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. Spread by fleas carried on rats, it thrived in the filthy living conditions. But the plague wasn't the only killer. Typhus, smallpox, and dysentery were constant threats. Without antibiotics or vaccines, even a small cut could become fatal. Doctors and medical knowledge was primitive. Many doctors believed illness came from an imbalance of humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments included bloodletting, literally draining blood from a patient, and herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. The idea of washing hands between patients? Non-existent. Perfume instead of soap. The wealthy masked odors with perfumes and scented gloves, but this only hid the problem. In fact, rich people's houses often smelled worse because of the sheer amount of rotting food and unwashed fabric inside. The poorer classes, on the other hand, were often stuck living in cramped huts with animals inside to keep warm. Conclusion. The Middle Ages were a perfect storm of poor hygiene, lack of medical understanding, and crowded living conditions. Without knowing it, people carried and spread diseases constantly, making them, quite literally, walking germ factories. The mysterious world of Victorian street food vendors. Picture this. It's a foggy morning in Victorian London. The cobblestone streets are slick with last night's rain. The air is heavy with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and something else. A smell you can't quite place. That's because it's a mix of roasting chestnuts, sizzling eels, and the faintly sour tang of yesterday's leftover stew. Welcome to the culinary adventure of the 19th century street food scene. The street vendors chorus before supermarkets, before fast food chains. Londoners relied on street vendors to feed them on the go. And these vendors didn't just stand quietly waiting for customers. Oh no. They sang, shouted, and called out their goods with catchy rhymes. Imagine walking through an alley and hearing, hot eels, buy 'em while they're alive," which sounds unsettling, until you realize alive was just a sales pitch. They were very much cooked. Hopefully. What was on the menu? If you were hungry in Victorian London, here's what you might find. Jellied eels, a dish so London that it still exists today in some parts. Freshwater eels were boiled, then cooled, until the natural gelatin set into a wobbly, fishy jelly. Meat pies, often delicious, but also potentially dangerous. Meat wasn't always fresh, and refrigeration didn't exist, so extra flavor was common. Baked potatoes, a safer choice, piping hot from coal ovens, and often sold by poor men hauling carts through the streets. Oysters. Back then, oysters were considered cheap street food, not luxury dining. Peas pudding, a thick savory paste made from split peas usually served with bread. The hygiene problem. Of course, this wasn't a time of modern health regulations. Food was prepared in tiny stalls, sometimes right next to open drains. Hand-washing facilities? Not likely. And if you were unlucky, you might bite into something. Unexpected. Still, Victorian Londoners didn't have much choice. For the poor, street food was often the only hot meal they could afford. The vendors, themselves. Many street vendors were women and children, hustling to make a few pennies. They carried baskets, pushed carts, or balanced trays on their heads. Some became local celebrities in their neighborhoods, known for their personalities as much as their food. The romanticized side. Despite the questionable hygiene, the street food scene had its charm. The glow of coal fires in the mist, the clatter of mugs, the shouts of vendors, and the warmth of hot food in freezing weather created a sense of community. For many, it wasn't just about eating, it was about belonging. When we imagine medieval Europe, our minds often drift to images of castles, knights, feasts, and grand tournaments. But beneath the romance of chivalry and courtly love lies a less glamorous reality. People in medieval Europe rarely bathed. And when they did, it was often a very different experience from what we might imagine today. To modern ears, this sounds both unhygienic and unpleasant, but there were deep-rooted cultural, religious, and practical reasons behind this strange habit. 1. The concept of cleanliness was different. In the medieval mindset, cleanliness wasn't primarily about removing dirt from the body. Instead, it was about balancing bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and keeping one's inner health stable. People believed that too much bathing could open the pores and let in dangerous diseases or miasma, bad air believed to cause illness. Thus, washing one's hands, face, and occasionally feet was considered enough for daily hygiene. A full-body bath was seen as rare and sometimes even risky. 2. Public bathhouses were common until they weren't. Believe it or not, in the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses were relatively popular across Europe, especially in towns influenced by Roman traditions. These bathhouses were often social gathering spots where people could relax, talk, and sometimes engage in more questionable activities. However, by the late Middle Ages, public bathhouses began to decline. The reasons were many. The spread of the Black Death in the 14th century made people fear communal bathing. Bathhouses became associated with sin and immorality in the eyes of the church. Wood-heated water was expensive, making large baths a luxury. By the 16th century, most public bathhouses had closed or transformed into entirely different businesses. 3. Religious influence against bathing. The medieval church played a big role in shaping ideas about cleanliness. While early Christian monks sometimes bathed for health, later religious leaders emphasized modesty and humility over physical appearance. Bathing naked, even in a private tub, was often frowned upon as immodest. Some extreme voices claimed that bathing too often encouraged vanity or even lust. Instead, spiritual cleanliness was considered far more important than physical cleanliness. 4. The dry cleaning method. Since full-body baths were rare, most people relied on what we might call a medieval version of dry cleaning. They would change their linen undergarments regularly. Linen absorbs sweat and oils. Rub themselves with cloths soaked in rose water or vinegar. Comb their hair to remove lice and dirt. Wash only certain parts of the body, hands, feet, and face. Rich nobles might even sprinkle themselves with scented powders or herbs to mask odors. 5. Seasonal bathing habits. Bathing was more common in summer than winter. In cold months, the risk of catching illness from cold air after a bath was considered too high. Some medieval Europeans might bathe once a month in summer and skip entire seasons in winter. 6. The influence of the Black Death. When the plague struck Europe, doctors at the time warned against bathing because they thought open pores made it easier for disease to enter the body. As strange as it sounds, people believed dirt acted as a protective layer. Some even wore the same clothes for months, letting them get stiff with grime. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly claimed she bathed once a month whether I needed or not, which was considered frequent at the time. 7. exceptions to the rule. Not everyone avoided bathing. Some medieval nobles and royals enjoyed elaborate baths scented with herbs like lavender and rosemary. These baths often included entertainment, meals, and even musicians. Still, such luxuries were rare and reserved for the wealthy. The arrival of soap existed in medieval Europe but was expensive and often harsh on the skin. Made from animal fat and lye, it was mostly used for washing clothes, not people. In some regions, olive oil-based soaps, like Castile soap, became popular among the rich, but the average peasant still had little access to it. 9. The social smell. With most people bathing rarely, body odor was simply part of everyday life. People were used to it, and so it wasn't considered socially offensive. Perfumes, scented gloves, and herbs were often carried to mask unpleasant smells in crowded markets or gatherings. 10. How this changed over time. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods slowly reintroduced bathing culture to Europe. By the 18th and 19th centuries, advances in plumbing and hygiene understanding led to more regular bathing. But in the medieval period, skipping a bath for weeks or months was entirely normal. So, next time you imagine strolling through a medieval castle or mingling at a knight's banquet, remember, behind the shining armor and silk gowns, there was likely a strong, earthy aroma in the air. For them, it was just part of life. For us, well, it might take some getting used to. Walking through the bustling streets of Victorian London in the mid-1800s, you hear the clattering of horse hooves on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors selling pies and hot potatoes, the laughter of children darting between carriages, and then suddenly, a whiff of something so foul that your eyes water. No, it's not just horse manure. Welcome to the world of Victorian sanitation, or rather, the lack of it. In an age before modern plumbing and sewage systems were widespread, the city's handling of human waste was nothing short of medieval. Chamber pots, those humble, round, ceramic or metal bowls, were a staple in every home. Since most people didn't have indoor bathrooms, they kept these pots in bedrooms under the bed or tucked away in a corner. At night or during cold mornings, these pots were used for, well, exactly what you're thinking. Now here's the fun part. What to do with the contents. Ideally, you would take the pot outside and empty it into a cesspit, privy, or the street's open drain. But Victorians, especially in crowded working-class neighborhoods, were not always so conscientious. It was not uncommon for people to simply open a window and yell "Gardy Loo," a holdover from an older practice in Scotland, before tossing the pot's contents into the street below. If you were unlucky enough to be walking past at that moment, well, let's just say you'd regret not wearing a hat. Public urination was also a routine part of city life. Men would casually relieve themselves against walls, behind carts, or into the gutters, even in broad daylight. This was so common that newspapers and satirical cartoons joked about urinary customs as if they were as normal as tipping one's hat. Women had fewer options, which made going out for long periods without access to a chamber pot or a sympathetic shopkeeper a real challenge. The sheer combination of human waste, horse manure, rotting food scraps, and industrial pollution created what historians call the Great Victorian Stink. This wasn't just a one-day event, it was a constant state of olfactory assault. In the summer months, when the Thames River became a slow-moving stew of sewage, dead animals, and chemical runoff, the smell was so unbearable that even Parliament had to soak its curtains in chloride of lime, a strong disinfectant, to keep the stench at bay. Interestingly, the bad smell wasn't just a nuisance, it was also feared as a direct cause of disease. The miasma theory, the belief that illnesses like cholera were spread by foul-smelling air, dominated medical thinking at the time. While the theory was wrong, cholera is waterborne, it did lead to some improvements in waste management, because if you believe disease comes from bad smells, you're at least motivated to clean up the stink. For those who could afford it, indoor plumbing became a status symbol toward the end of the Victorian era. Houses with flushing toilets, running water, and proper sewage connections were rare luxuries in the 1840s and 1850s, but became more common by the 1890s. Still, for the vast majority of London's population, the daily reality was chamber pots, overflowing cesspits, and streets that doubled as open sewers. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a public restroom that's out of toilet paper, remember, at least you're not dodging chamber pot missiles on your way home. The Victorians didn't just smell bad. Their entire city was a sensory adventure you'd probably never forget, even if you tried. Victorian London was famous, or rather infamous, for its pea souper fogs. If you've ever seen a Sherlock Holmes adaptation, you've probably pictured him walking through swirling yellow mist, gas lamp barely visible, shadows lurking in alleyways. But the truth is, these fogs weren't just atmospheric, they were deadly. And their cause was a perfect storm of industrial pollution, poor urban planning, and complete ignorance about air quality. The nickname pea souper came from the thick greenish-yellow hue of the fog. Imagine breathing through a wet scarf dipped in soot and sulfur. That's essentially what it was, a dense mixture of natural fog and coal smoke from thousands of chimneys. Every home, factory, and workshop in London burned coal for heating, cooking, and industry. The smoke contained soot, sulfur dioxide, and a cocktail of chemicals that turned fog into a toxic cloud. During cold, windless days in winter, these pollutants would hang over the city, trapped by temperature inversions. Visibility could drop to just a few feet, bringing traffic, horse-drawn and on foot, to a crawl. People would bump into lampposts, fall into the Thames, or vanish into alleyways, sometimes never to be seen again. But the real danger was to the lungs. Prolonged exposure could cause bronchitis, pneumonia, and even death. One of the most infamous examples came later, in 1952, during the Great Smog of London, when thousands died within days. But in Victorian times, these fogs were so common that people accepted them as normal. Writers described them poetically. Artists painted them romantically. Nobody connected them directly to premature death, at least not until much later. The smell was horrendous too, a sulfurous, acrid stench that stuck to your clothes and hair. Washing didn't help much, since clean water itself was hard to come by in the city. Some people would tie vinegar-soaked rags around their faces, hoping it might filter out the worst of the fumes. It didn't really work, but at least it made breathing slightly more bearable. The fogs had another curious side effect. They were a criminal's dream. Pickpockets, muggers, and even murderers used the low visibility to their advantage. Police could barely see their own hands, let alone chase someone through the smog. This gave London's criminal underworld an eerie, almost supernatural cover. It's worth noting that not everyone hated the fog. Some businesses, like the makers of heavy cloaks and hats, did well because people wanted protection from the damp and soot, and mystery novelists loved it. The fog was practically a character in their stories. But beneath that romantic veneer lay a grim reality. Every breath you took was slowly poisoning you. Victorians didn't have modern air purifiers or knowledge about particulate matter, so they simply endured it. Children grew up with persistent coughs, and the elderly often didn't survive particularly bad fog spells. In hindsight, the pea souper was less a charming quirk of London life and more an invisible killer. It's one of those historical details that sounds quaint, until you realize that if you were transported back there for just a few days, you'd likely be hacking, wheezing, and desperately longing for clean air. When you picture Victorian dining, you might imagine candlelit tables, polished silverware, and lavish feasts. And yes, for the wealthy elite, that image is partly accurate. But for the majority of people living in the Victorian era, dinner was less about elegance and more about survival. And sometimes it was downright questionable by today's standards. The aristocratic table, let's start with the upper class. Wealthy Victorian families followed elaborate dining rituals, often eating several courses in a single meal. These courses could include soups, roasts, fish, pies, puddings, and exotic fruits imported from distant colonies. Meals were a display of status, not just sustenance. Even the arrangement of the table was carefully planned. Fresh flowers, gleaming silver, and perfectly folded napkins were all part of the show. It wasn't unusual for a high society dinner to have up to 7 or 8 courses, each paired with wine or sherry. Servants moved in almost choreographed fashion, clearing plates and presenting the next dish without disturbing conversation. The goal was refinement and abundance. Middle-class meals. Middle-class Victorians aspired to imitate the upper class, but with smaller budgets. They might serve roast beef or mutton on Sundays, supplemented with boiled potatoes and vegetables. During the week, meals were simpler: bread, cheese, cold meats, and soups made from leftover bones and scraps. Middle-class dining still adhered to manners. Meals were eaten at a set time with everyone seated together, and it was considered rude to start eating before the head of the household. Working-class reality. For the working class, dinner was often just another word for the only hot meal of the day. It usually consisted of cheap cuts of meat, bread, dripping, the fat from cooked meat, and maybe some root vegetables. Poor families relied heavily on bread and tea, with meat being a rare luxury. Street food was common in working-class neighborhoods. Meat pies, baked potatoes, or whelks, a type of sea snail, sold from carts. It was cheap, quick, and didn't require the family to use precious fuel for cooking. Questionable ingredients. One unsettling truth about Victorian dining is that food safety was, well, almost non-existent. Adulteration was rampant. To make food look fresher or more appealing, sellers might add dangerous substances. Bread could be whitened with alum or chalk. Beer might be sweetened with lead. Milk could be diluted with water, sometimes from contaminated pumps. The lack of regulations meant you never truly knew what you were eating. Victorian table manners, table etiquette was a serious matter in polite society. Talking with your mouth full? Absolutely unacceptable. Elbows on the table? Social suicide. Men were expected to carve meat for the table, while women poured tea or coffee afterward. Napkins were to be placed on the lap, not tucked into the collar. Interestingly, people didn't serve themselves from a central dish the way we often do today. Servants or the host would serve each plate individually, emphasizing the host's generosity. Exotic and imported foods. The Victorian era was Britain's age of empire, and that empire's reach extended to the dinner table. Sugar, tea, coffee, cocoa, spices, and tropical fruits became more common, though still expensive. Bananas, for example, were a rare treat. Pineapples were such a luxury that some wealthy families rented them for dinner parties just to display as a centerpiece without actually eating them. Dining as a social event. For the upper and middle classes, dining was also entertainment. Dinners could last for hours, with conversation as carefully cultivated as the food. Topics ranged from literature to politics to gossip. Servants were expected to be silent and invisible, gliding in and out with dishes while guests debated over roast duck and Madeira wine. The Victorian cookbook boom. The rise of literacy in the 19th century brought with it a boom in cookbooks. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management became a must-have for middle-class wives, offering recipes, meal plans, and advice on entertaining. This wasn't just about food. It was about projecting respectability and order. Conclusion. Victorian dining habits tell us a lot about class divisions, hygiene standards, and the social rules of the time. For the rich, dinner was an art form. For the poor, it was a daily struggle. But whether eating a lavish 10-course meal or a simple bowl of potato soup, Victorians treated the act of dining as something important, ritualized, structured, and steeped in social meaning. Picture this: no Netflix, no YouTube, no TikTok, not even a radio. How on earth did people survive? Well, in Victorian London, people had to get a little creative when it came to entertainment. And believe it or not, some of their favorite pastimes might surprise you. First, there were the theaters. Victorians absolutely adored live performances, from grand operas and Shakespearean plays to rowdy music hall shows, filled with singing, dancing, and sometimes a bit of cheeky humor. For the upper classes, attending a theater was not just about the performance. It was also a social event, a chance to see and be seen. People dressed in their finest clothes, arriving in carriages, ready to applaud the stars of the stage. For the working class, cheaper tickets meant sitting in the upper galleries, often so far from the stage that the actors looked like moving dots. But they didn't mind. They went for the atmosphere, the laughter, and the escape from everyday struggles. Then there was reading. In an era before streaming services, books, magazines, and newspapers were the main form of storytelling. Penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized novels full of sensational crimes, monsters, and mysteries, were wildly popular. Titles like Varney the Vampire and Sweeney Todd were devoured by eager readers week after week. Victorians also loved parlor games. Think of them as the 19th century version of party games. Families would gather around in the evenings to play charades, tell ghost stories, or even try their hand at table turning, a spooky game that claimed to communicate with spirits. Public lectures were another popular pastime, especially for the curious-minded. Scientists, explorers, and inventors would give talks about their discoveries. Imagine hearing about the wonders of electricity for the very first time, or seeing strange artifacts brought back from distant lands. It was as thrilling as watching a blockbuster movie today. And of course, there were outdoor activities. Parks were becoming more common in cities, and people enjoyed strolling, boating, or simply sitting and people-watching. On special occasions, there were fairs and exhibitions, complete with exotic animals, new inventions, and bizarre sideshows that drew massive crowds. So even without screens, Victorians knew how to keep themselves entertained. They had stories, music, games, and gatherings, proving that human creativity doesn't really depend on technology, just on the desire to connect and be amused. If you think modern cities can be risky, Victorian London was on a whole different level. In the 19th century, danger was lurking around every cobblestone corner, and not just from pickpockets or shady characters in dark alleys. The biggest threat to your life often came from something you couldn't even see: disease. One of the deadliest problems was cholera. It spread through contaminated water, and because many parts of London didn't have proper sewage systems, waste often ended up in the River Thames, the same river people drank from. Outbreaks could kill thousands in a matter of weeks. There was also tuberculosis, often called consumption, which caused a slow, painful decline and was almost always fatal. It thrived in the cramped, damp, and poorly ventilated housing where the working class lived. For children, life was especially dangerous. Many didn't survive past their 5th birthday due to illnesses like measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever. Doctors had limited knowledge, and treatments were often ineffective, or worse, harmful. In the streets, danger wasn't just biological. Horse-drawn traffic accidents were common, as carriages and carts clattered through busy roads with no traffic lights or pedestrian crossings. Factories, meanwhile, were full of unsafe machinery that could easily crush or maim workers. Then there was pollution. London's famous fog wasn't just mist. It was a choking cloud of coal smoke, soot, and industrial fumes. Breathing it in for years could lead to chronic lung problems. In winter, killer fogs sometimes became so thick and toxic that hundreds died in just a few days. And if you wandered into the wrong part of town after dark, you might encounter another danger: crime. While the city had a police force, they weren't always effective at catching thieves, con men, or even violent criminals. In short, Victorian London was exciting and full of opportunity, but it was also a place where survival often depended on luck, quick thinking, and a strong immune system. Victorian London wasn't just a place of science, industry, and progress. It was also a city steeped in odd beliefs and superstitions. Even as new inventions were changing the world, many Londoners still clung to old traditions and strange ideas that might seem bizarre today. One of the most common beliefs was in omens and signs. If a black cat crossed your path, it could be either good or bad luck, depending on which part of the city you were from. Spilling salt was considered unlucky, but you could fix it by tossing a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil. Death was surrounded by especially elaborate superstitions. People believed that if a mirror was left uncovered after someone died, their soul could get trapped inside it. That's why families would often drape mirrors with black cloth during mourning. Clocks in the house were stopped at the exact time of death to prevent bad luck and keep death from lingering. Many Victorians also believed in spiritualism, the idea that you could communicate with the dead. Seances became wildly popular, with mediums claiming to hear messages from spirits, make tables levitate, or even summon ghostly apparitions. While some people truly believed, others attended these events more for entertainment than faith. Health superstitions were everywhere too. Some thought carrying a potato in your pocket could prevent rheumatism, or that wearing certain charms could keep away illness. Others believed you could cure warts by rubbing them with raw meat and then burying it under a full moon. Even respectable Londoners might refuse to walk under a ladder, step over a crack in the pavement, or start a journey on a Friday. And when it came to love, charms and fortune tellers were in high demand. Young women often used tricks like placing a sprig of rosemary under their pillow to dream of their future husband. These superstitions offered a sense of comfort in a world that was often dangerous and uncertain. In the dimly lit, foggy streets of Victorian